The order was simple. Turn your back, cover your eyes, and under no circumstances look into the flash.
It began quietly, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit world of hospital morgues and coroner's offices. For 21 years, from 1957 to 1978, an unseen directive was passed down. During autopsies performed on 21,000 Australian citizens, many of them children, a small additional sample was to be taken. A piece of bone, extracted before the family was ever notified. Each sample was carefully labeled, packaged, and sent to a government laboratory where it was systematically burned to ash. The entire operation, hidden from the public, was designed to measure the concentration of a radioactive poison that the Australian government and its chief scientific advisor were swearing on their reputations did not exist. To understand how a nation ends up secretly testing the bones of its own children, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to a single moment in the pre-dawn chill of a New Mexico desert. The date is July 16, 1945. The time is 5:29 a.m. Inside the control bunker, the air is thick with sweat and the smell of ozone. A low hum of electronics is the only sound. For the scientists and soldiers gathered there, the world has shrunk to the hands of a clock and a single switch. They are about to pull a trigger on a weapon that draws its power from the heart of a star. Humanity is holding its breath. And in that bunker, one of the men responsible for the final countdown, for making sure the trigger works, is a British physicist named Ernest Titterton. As a senior member of the timing group at Los Alamos, Titterton wasn't just a witness to the Trinity test. He was one of its chief architects, a specialist from the British mission entrusted with the complex mechanics of nuclear detonation. He didn't just see the first atomic bomb, he initiated it. His authority was so absolute, he was retained for the next major tests, Operation Crossroads at Bikini Atoll, where he personally conducted the countdown. This was a man who possessed a level of knowledge and experience that less than 24 people on Earth could claim.
So we're talking about one of the actual architects of the atomic bomb, not just some bloke who read about it. He literally pushed the button on the first one.
Precisely. And in 1950, that same man accepted the first ever chair in nuclear physics at the Australian National University. On paper, it was a prestigious academic appointment. In reality, it was a strategic move. With Britain desperate for a new testing ground after losing access to American facilities, Australia became the institutional bridgehead for the Anglosphere's nuclear ambitions. Titterton, connected to every leading nuclear physicist in the Western world, was the perfect man to oversee it. Prime Minister Robert Menzies, eager to maintain imperial links, agreed, and the stage was set for 12 major nuclear weapons tests and hundreds of smaller so-called minor trials across the Montebello Islands, Emu Field, and a remote patch of South Australian desert that would soon become infamous, Maralinga.
Let me get this straight. Britain asks, "Mind if we borrow your backyard to let off a few city-destroying weapons?" And our Prime Minister's only question was, "Will you be wanting tea and biscuits with that?"
With the tests now moving to Australian soil, the government needed more than just scientific oversight. It needed a performance of safety. In July of 1955, the curtain rose on that performance with the formation of the Australian Atomic Weapons Tests Safety Committee, or AWTSC. Sir Ernest Titterton, the man who had pushed the button at Trinity, was its star player, a founding member, and later its chairman. The official script was one of absolute reassurance. This committee, the public was told, was Australia's watchdog. It had full veto power. Its sole purpose was to protect Australian lives, Australian land, and Australian interests from any potential harm. It was a shield of scientific integrity.
A safety committee. Right. I bet its official motto was just, "Don't worry, she'll be right," printed on a lead-lined letterhead.
The committee's public assurances were comprehensive, its scientific credentials impeccable. One member, Professor L.H. Martin, gave what he called an unequivocal assurance that there is a complete bill of health. All dangerous fallout has been deposited, and the remaining fallout is completely innocuous. Titterton himself went even further, promoting nuclear power as the cheapest, cleanest, and safest method of power production yet devised by man.
Cheapest, cleanest, and safest. Right. He also left out great for local property values and really brings the community together in a class action lawsuit a few decades later.
The message was authoritative. It was reassuring, and it was a lie. The first fatal flaw was in the timing. The safety committee was formed after the first tests at Montebello and Emu Field had already taken place. Its fundamental design was not to assess risk, but to provide what one historian called a respected scientific face to calm public fears. And in Titterton's own private files, the deception becomes undeniable. In a 1957 letter, he admitted that while they had so far avoided the detection of radioactivity spreading to populated areas, we cannot guarantee this in future operations. This is the smoking gun. The man publicly guaranteeing absolute safety was privately admitting it was impossible. That same year, he secretly wrote to the British Atomic Authority at Harwell requesting they begin taking measurements for strontium-90 contamination in Australia, even as his own committee was failing to do the same.
Hang on. So publicly, he's telling everyone it's completely safe, but in his private letters, he's admitting he can't actually guarantee that? That's not a miscommunication, that's a lie.
It was a lie born of a fundamental conflict of interest. Decades later, in 1985, a royal commission would deliver the historical verdict. The commission found that Titterton, quote, served the interests of the UK rather than Australia, close quote. He wasn't an Australian scientist protecting his nation. He was the British government's Australian custodian, a foreign agent in institutional clothing, whose primary job was to ensure the tests went ahead with minimal local interference. You cannot serve two masters when one is conducting dangerous experiments on the other's soil. This wasn't negligence, it was divided loyalty, and one man was about to expose it. Dr. Hedley Marston was one of Australia's most respected scientists, a senior researcher at the CSIRO. Working outside the official safety apparatus, Marston began his own independent monitoring project. His findings were devastating. He discovered iodine-131 in the thyroid glands of sheep and cattle across the continent, at concentrations 4,000 times normal levels. The data was undeniable. A radioactive plume from the tests had passed directly over Adelaide, contaminating vast swaths of the country far beyond the official test zones. Marston went public, accusing the safety committee of evasive lying and declaring them culpable for the contamination of Australia.
4,000 times, not 4% more. 4,000 times what should be there naturally.
Exactly. Marston's data wasn't just an inconvenient truth, it was a declaration of war against the entire safety narrative. And Titterton and the nuclear establishment reacted with the institutional equivalent of overwhelming force. What followed was described as perhaps the most unseemly episode in 20th century Australian science. A bitter scientific civil war fought not in labs, but in the corridors of power. Titterton and his allies worked vigorously behind the scenes, using their international prestige to discredit Marston's methods and delay his publications. When that wasn't enough, they deployed the full weight of the state. Australia's own security service, ASIO, opened a file on Hedley Marston, targeting him as a scientist of counter-espionage interest. The inversion was utterly surreal. The scientist whose data proved a direct threat to the Australian population was being investigated as a national security risk, while the scientist serving British interests, who privately knew the risks were real, was chairing the National Safety Committee. It was a ruthless suppression campaign designed to bury the truth along with the man who found it.
Okay, just so I have the timeline straight. The bloke pointing out that the country is actively being poisoned gets the spies sicked on him, while the bloke in charge of the poisoning is chairing the safety committee. Got it. Makes perfect, logical sense.
The official record notes that on October 15, 1953, the first of 2 atomic devices was detonated at Emu Field. But for the Anangu people living at Wallatina and Wellborn Hill, the reality was far more visceral. Sometime after the Earth shuddered, a strange, dark cloud crept across the landscape. Survivors described it not as smoke, but as a thick, rolling mist, cold, greasy, and silent. It clung to the ground, blanketing everything in a fine, black dust that smelled of metal and death. What followed was a wave of sickness, a sudden, violent vomiting, racking diarrhea, skin that broke out in weeping sores. For many, their sight began to fail, dissolving into a permanent, milky blindness. These weren't acceptable risks calculated in a distant briefing room. These were the textbook symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, experienced by human beings living on land the government had dismissed as uninhabited. The truth was, the desert wasn't empty. It was just inhabited by people they chose not to count.
This systematic disregard for human life extended to their own military personnel, who were treated not as soldiers, but as scientific instruments. At the Maralinga test site during Operation Buffalo, a special group of soldiers was designated the Indoctrinee Force. Their official purpose was indoctrination, to experience the effects of a nuclear detonation up close, to remove the fear of the unknown. The reality was far darker. They were ordered into the forward area, sometimes less than 2 kilometers from ground zero, with nothing more than their standard issue cotton uniforms for protection. They were told to sit on the ground, face away from the blast, and cover their eyes. They felt the heat flash through their clothes. They saw the bones in their hands illuminated by the X-ray pulse. Then came the earth-shattering roar of the shockwave, kicking up a wall of radioactive dust and debris that washed over them. They had no protective clothing, no radiation monitoring badges. They were human guinea pigs, used to gather data on the psychological and physical effects of atomic warfare.
They sent Australian soldiers into a nuclear test zone with no protection and no way to even measure their exposure? That's not an experiment. That's a war crime against your own troops.
It was protocol, all happening under the watch of the safety committee Titterton chaired. But the mushroom clouds, for all their terrible spectacle, were not the most enduring threat. The real, permanent danger came from the so-called minor trials, hundreds of cold-blooded experiments designed to see what would happen if a nuclear warhead cracked open on the ground. In the Vixen B trials at the Taranaki test site, this meant deliberately dispersing 22.2 kilograms of plutonium-239 across the red desert soil. The half-life of plutonium-239 is 24,100 years. It is a timescale so vast it resists human comprehension. The pyramids of Giza have existed for less than a fifth of that time. This was an intergenerational crime, an act that has committed the Australian landscape to a state of eternal contamination. We are currently less than 0.3% of the way through its first radioactive decay period. and every single one of these experiments was approved by the safety committee Titterton chaired. And this brings us back to the bones. Faced with Marston's undeniable proof of widespread contamination, the government needed its own data. But it could not admit he was right. So from 1957, the same year Titterton was privately requesting British monitoring, a secret program began. During autopsies on 21,000 Australians, mostly children, bone samples were taken, without consent, without disclosure. The bones were ashed and analyzed for strontium-90. This secret harvest is the ultimate proof of betrayal. The government possessed full, private knowledge that the danger was real. They knew Marston had been right. And while they continued their public denials, they were harvesting the bones of dead children to measure just how badly they had poisoned their own people.
I need you to just sit with that for a second. 21,000 dead Australians, mostly kids, and the government secretly took their bones to prove to themselves what they were publicly denying to everyone else.
The reckoning, when it finally came, was televised. In 1984, the Australian government convened a royal commission. It was a national inquiry with the full power to subpoena witnesses and unearth classified documents. Presided over by the formidable Justice Jim McClelland, the commission became a courtroom for half a century of secrets. For months, the nation watched as the official narrative was systematically dismantled, witness by witness, document by document. The Safety Committee's credibility was shredded under forensic cross-examination. The final report was a bombshell. It found that Titterton had aided and abetted the British government in concealing key facts from the Australian public. It officially confirmed his role as the UK's Australian custodian. The Safety Committee, McClelland concluded with judicial force, had failed in its most fundamental mission. The Shield was a sham. But it was Justice McClelland's public characterization of Titterton that would seal his legacy. He called him a Dr. Strangelove figure. The comparison was devastating. Stanley Kubrick's satirical nuclear scientist, brilliant, fanatical, and pathologically detached from the human consequences of his work. The image crystallized everything. A mind so devoted to the power of the atom and so loyal to the British establishment that his ethical duty to his adapted nation became secondary. In the end, the man who helped trigger the atomic age became the man who poisoned a continent and denied it was happening. Today, the physical indictment of that legacy remains, baked into the very soil of South Australia. If you were to stand at the Taronki site, you would see little more than red earth and spinifex stretching to a heat-hazed horizon. But the danger here is invisible and eternal. The cleanup attempts of the 1990s, which involved scraping up the topsoil and burying it in a shallow pit, are now seen as a catastrophic failure. The plutonium remains. The land is a sacrifice zone, fenced off and signed with warnings. It is a permanent wound on the Australian continent, a landscape that will tick with a quiet poison for 24,000 years, outlasting our cities, our nations, and the memory of every single person involved in its creation.
And that's Titterton's real legacy. Not the bomb he helped create, not the tests he oversaw. It's 24,000 years of contamination on Australian soil that he swore to our faces was perfectly safe. Right, so that's the case file on Titterton, and it is a heavy one. It makes you wonder what else is buried in the archives. As we keep digging into these stories, make sure you join the journey with us. Become one of the legends. Hit that subscribe button, and we'll see you on the next investigation.
The Maralinga deception shows how an official narrative can be constructed to conceal a devastating truth. But what happens when that deception is woven into the fabric of our wartime history and celebrated as a heroic victory for over 60 years?
Wait, are you talking about the midget sub-attack on Sydney Harbor? I learned about that in school. A couple of them got in, we blew them up, end of story. A close call, but a clear win for us.
That is the official story. But it's a fiction. For 64 years, the truth of what happened that night, the ignored warnings, the catastrophic failures of command, and the real killer submarine all lay hidden at the bottom of the ocean. Our next case file is on Australia's fake war trophy.